On development success. I'm Paul Collier. I'm chairing this session, which is a presentation of a major new study by UN Wider, run by Augustin Fossou. There are two books that are being launched here under the rubric of development success. One looking at historical accounts from more advanced economies, and the other achieving development success, looking at strategies and lessons from the developing world. So without more ado, I'm going to turn to Augustin Fossou, who's overseen this project, run it, and so he will be presenting first. Then we'll turn to Ron Finley, who's a contributor, and to Anke Huffler, who's a contributor. Thank you. Augustin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm looking outside there. It looks fairly cold. But it's much colder in Helsinki, I was assured this morning. And that reminded me of November 2006 when I arrived in Helsinki. And it was very cold, as I recall. And it wasn't very bright either. Indeed, it was miserable. So I was looking for some excitement. And excitement I got. The UN Wider project, Country Role Models for Development Success, was already on the books. So I was supposed to implement it, right? It was very exciting. So I set out to do that, and I discovered that among the countries being considered as candidates, very good candidates, were Greece and Spain, and I believe Italy and Ireland. So I told myself, well, these look like success stories now, but are they going to be success stories later? So really trying to decide which countries to include, which ones to exclude, was very, very difficult. In any case, I'll skip the outline. I went ahead and I included close to 30 countries in there. And by the way, the good news is that neither Greece nor Spain was included. How did I do that? I was being very scientific. I went through, looked at the data, and I said, look, this is really, this foundation doesn't look very good, so let's exclude them. Or maybe I had a premonition. Or maybe I was just lucky. In any case, so that was a project, essentially. And out of that project came two books. The OUP books, which Paul has just talked about, had mentioned. The first being Development Success, Historical Accounts from More Advanced Countries, where I said, well, we can learn something about these advanced countries, even though it seems like eons ago when they developed. And there are three sets of countries. The Nordics, obviously. Anyone who's interested in development success almost always includes the Nordics, right? So I did the same thing. Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Other advanced industrialized countries. Japan, Ireland. Sorry, I had to include Ireland. I understand that Ireland is not such a disaster. Indeed, I'm informed that Ireland will be getting out of the economic mess very soon, and Switzerland. And also transition economies of the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. Now, at the end of each country grouping is a synthesis. In addition to that, there's an overall synthesis for the book. Now, book 2. Achieving Development Success, Strategies and Lessons from the Developing World. This is a much bigger book. By the way, I must confess that I've not seen the bigger book yet. I've not seen this book at all. Although I understand that it's much bigger. And this also has the geographical groupings, East Asia and the Pacific. You can see the countries indicated: South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. The emerging Asian giants, India and China. Sub-Saharan Africa, Botswana, Mauritius, South Africa, and Ghana. And then Latin America and the Caribbean, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic. The Middle East and North Africa, MENA, we have Oman and Bahrain, Tunisia, and the United Arab Emirates. So, in the first book, we have as many as 10 countries. In the second, we have 18 countries. That's why the second book is much bigger. Again, following the same format, we have the regional syntheses and then overall synthesis. Well, how these two books, by the way, that different from the existing studies? I mentioned just 3 of them here. I'm sure there must be a whole bunch of them, just 3. The one by Lal, the political economy of poverty, equity and growth, a comparative study. This one here pairs up countries, compares them. This one has done great. This one hasn't done so great, even though they had similar characteristics. Then there's a book by Daniel Roderick, In Search of Prosperity, Analytical Narratives on Economic Growth. And here, the success really is in the form of institutions and how institutions affected growth. And there are 13 countries that are analyzed in this book. And finally, you have the Spencer et al., known as the Growth Report, Strategies for Sustained Growth and Inclusive Development. And there are 13 success cases identified here. Now, the present study, as I indicated, or I should say present studies, as I indicated earlier, certainly are much bigger. We're talking about a total of close to 30 countries, and we cover developed, or if you like, advanced countries and developing countries, different levels of development, and we also make sure that all regions are covered, if you will, and so on. And success is a little bit broader, not just institutions, not just growth, but obviously we also looked at human development indicators and so on, and looked at the underlying forces to indicate whether indeed what was the path toward development, and if indeed we can learn from those strategies. Now, the first book, in Advanced Countries. 11 themes are analyzed. Obviously, I can't go through all these and discuss each one of them. Instead, I'll just rattle through them. The first is the market and public provision harmony. And simply, there must be an optimal mix of public and private participation. And I use a number of the countries to discuss that. There's a public financing, to what extent we can generate funds, whether externally, through, say, external support or domestic financing. I discussed the theme of social risk minimization under egalitarianism, and this involves mostly the Nordic countries, social welfare sustainability and resource economies. Obviously, you have Norway presenting a very interesting case, but also the other Nordic countries, which actually evolved from agricultural economies with fisheries and forestry and so on to become advanced countries. Eventually, openness, institutional capabilities. The theme that essentially says, yes, openness is fine, but countries must have capabilities to be able to take advantage of openness. Social and political harmony. Peace, obviously, is necessary for any type of sustained development. Business-government partnership, where, again, you can have peace, a dialogue between governments and business. Complementary human capital, where we ensure that the human capital, indeed, is complementary with other forms of capital infrastructure in particular, you actually can turn it around and talk about economic infrastructure being complementary to human capital, macroeconomic stability and policy consistency, obviously necessary, and a number of these countries, just all of them had this, government capacity and the transition, and this really has to do a lot with the transition economies, where government capacity was really sine qua non in terms of the ability to transition properly. And the dichotomy here is made between the countries that were chosen, the Soviet and Russia, where indeed not much capacity was retained. And I do recall that Popov, who wrote the synthesis chapter, was very, very hard on Russia and praised these countries. He said, finally, industrial structure, in terms of small-scale, kind of low-tech, kinds of industry, being an important element. What I'll do next then is to highlight some of these roles. Now, it was very clear from the case studies that there was substantial government role, no doubt about it at all. And in the case of Nordic countries, much role with respect to the social infrastructure, if you will, making sure that it was indeed quite sound, not just statically, but intertemporally as well. But the actual production was left in private hands. I know that there's all kinds of paradigms, whether the government should take the leading role and that kind of stuff and so on, but at least for the Nordic countries, that was indeed the case. Now, universality of social welfare, especially education, is an important element for the Nordic countries. I know that obviously can be very costly, as opposed to using means-testedness, but that is the way that you guarantee everyone, whether the person is rich or poor, and therefore you get a buy-in into the system. One can talk about the pros and cons of this. Also, sound natural resource management was an important factor here. In the case of Norway, and it's interesting that the sovereign fund petroleum fund now is called a pension fund. That obviously is a way to ensure that the welfare system can indeed continue. Now, you also have, in terms of management, Statoil, and Statoil was a government agency that ensured that there were enough backward and forward linkages to the rest of the economy to ensure ongoing sustainable development. Efficient use of external aid by Ireland is a case in point in terms of the role of finances here. There's much kind of mislining the role of aid in the development process. Now, in the case of Ireland, you had the EU structural funds that were used. And indeed, one could look at them as being external aid, no doubt about that. That was used to improve infrastructure in the economy. But perhaps more importantly, there were best practice used in terms of rules associated with utilization of these funds. And those rules were actually mainstreamed. Later on, you might ask me then, how come Ireland get in so much trouble? That's another story. There's also diversity in management in terms, for example, contestability in the case of Switzerland, where if you have various cantons, various ethnic groups, and so on, what is the appropriate mechanism to manage that diversity? And what the authors refer to as political contestability is a situation where you almost give veto power to each of the cantons, in Switzerland in this case, and that would ensure that the outcome is acceptable, if you will, to all the various groups. In some sense, one could think of the intersection or the preferences of the various cantons or the various ethnic groups as being some form of core. It's not the usual, Debrew scarf core in economics, but perhaps one could view it as a political, type of core. And hopefully it will not be a null set. Let's hope that indeed it is going to be a non-null set, and it will be wide enough in order to be able to make optimal decisions. Now, maintaining government capacity in transition economies, I already mentioned that among these transition countries, that was an important element for their success. Now, infrastructure complementarity, as I mentioned earlier, and Japan is a very good example of this. Obviously, human capital was important, social capital was important, social infrastructure was important, but there was a lot of emphasis on infrastructural complementarity by developing quite a bit of economic infrastructure. The author of the Kumari, as I recall, placed quite a bit of emphasis on this for Japan. Now, finally, social partnership. And this is where you have partnership among businesses, about government and labor to manage the process. Ireland, in particular, is credited with the use of this type of social partnership to manage the process and to produce very good results, and making sure that wages were not too high, for example, ensuring that there were not too many strikes, etc., was an important element that was used. Now, it also turns out that, indeed, the authors claim that the inability or the failure to continue this social partnership is actually responsible for the subsequent economic fiasco in Ireland. That indeed, if they continued the social partnership, they could have reined in the excesses of the financial exuberance, if you will. The developing world. Here I have 6 themes as opposed to 11 themes. Now it's interesting because we have a much bigger book. So how come I have only 6 themes? Well, there are a lot more contents, if you will, here. One thing that was very clear among the various cases, especially Malaysia in particular, there was this kind of dynamic interplay between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, orthodox and heterodox policies. When the price of rubber went up, for example, they used the funds to experiment quite a lot. And when they ran into problems economically, bottlenecks, they then turned to the use of orthodoxy. I mean, to decrease imbalances and have a greater macroeconomic stability in these countries. And it's not just Malaysia. Indeed, among most of the case studies, Chile, Brazil, Dominican Republic, and so on, there was much use of heterodox policies initially, and then the imbalances that eventually emerged were corrected by use of orthodox kinds of policies. Now, I mentioned earlier that capability was important for the advanced countries, so it was for the developing world. Internal and external capability. Obviously, you can build the government internally to ensure that they make the right decisions, a capable type of government. You can build infrastructure, and so on. But there's also the external element of it, especially in the WTO rules these days. It is not the good old days when any country could do whatever the country wanted, pretty much. Now we are reigning by WTO rules. In particular, you have the TRIMS, that is the trade-related investment measures, and the TRIPS, and that is the intellectual property, rules that tend to constrain the behavior of governments, if you will. In some sense, it is a good idea, but in another sense, it makes it difficult for them to have, especially these developed countries, to have the capability to operate like the other countries used to operate. The third theme is the primary export diversification and financing. And here, the role of FDI can be very important for a number of these countries, Vietnam, Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and so on. In many of these countries, the role of external aid, once again, can be important. And in the case of Ghana, there's absolutely no way Ghana, for example, could have achieved the economic success that has achieved today without aid. Obviously, if you're going to have reforms, you want to make sure that you have enough buy-in, and that cannot be done costlessly. In the case of Vietnam, aid has also played an important role. There are other examples as well. Domestic resource mobilization. In the final analysis, no country can maintain sustainable development without having strong domestic resource mobilization. Thailand and a number of these countries engaged successfully in that. Natural resource economies, the examples of Bahrain, Oman, Botswana, obviously, that were able to manage their resources quite well. Managing diversity is crucial. India, for example, managing diversity has been quite important. And the role of institutions and governance, what they talk about. Indeed, I was talking with the chair a few minutes ago, and he mentioned this chapter that's written by Robinson about Botswana. Botswana, obviously, is an important example of where the role of institutions has been quite important, in Mauritius as well. And then human development, Finley, that's an important theme, because again, there's no way you're going to be able to have sustainable development without having the appropriate human development to form the basis for. Now some highlights. One of the cases, when you think about China, you can think about all kinds of things about China. The role of governments and all these kinds of things, and about China, all kinds of strategies there. But the author of this case study emphasized something that he referred to as disinterested government as an important political economy that brought about success in China. And that is, the system was such that the government did not favor any particular interest group. Of course, this is debatable. You could debate it and all that. But he makes a very strong case that really underlies the important success of China. I'll leave it at that for now. The Washington Consensus-based reforms of Ghana and China. I know that many, many people believe that the Washington Consensus is dead, right? As a matter of fact, a very important economist, Danny Roderick, said that, well, the Washington Consensus is dead, but it's been replaced by Washington Confucianism. Right. And so now, whenever you start talking about the Washington Consensus, it gives the wrong impression that you are trying to have one of revisionism, kind of revisionism, kinds of tendencies. But I do believe, and others agree with me, that the Washington Consensus, despite all the negative aspects, must have played an important role. And let me read this, if I may, from one of the authors, the Chinese chapter, and I quote, "If there are success cases of the Washington Consensus, China must be counted as one of them." That sounds strange, doesn't it? Well, I'm going to support that statement and also state that if indeed there's been a success of the Washington Consensus, Ghana must be counted as one of them. There are all kinds of reasons why people hate the Washington Consensus. Straitjacket nature of the consensus, not respecting the social norms, if you will, to some extent, the cash and carry and all that kind of stuff that people talk about the Washington Consensus. But let's face it, if the Washington Consensus had not been used as a basis for the market reforms that occurred in Ghana, obviously Ghana would have never made it. And there's another aspect too. Even the straitjacket nature of it can be important, because the politicians can always say, look, it is not our fault. We are not the ones who are imposing this very bitter medicine. Blame Washington, blame the IMF, blame the World Bank. Otherwise, you cannot effect these reforms. The economic diversification strategies, which I'll just go through fairly quickly, very clear in the UAE, in Bahrain and Oman. in terms of moving away from the dominated economy to a more diversified country through tax policies and so on. Again, I'm not being very specific here. The point is that if I became too specific, then there would be no need for you to go and buy those books and read them. So I just want to kind of appetize you to these things. As I also mentioned earlier, the dynamic heterodox orthodox strategy that was used in Malaysia and Vietnam, which I've mentioned, no need for me to repeat that. There's the effective natural resource management of Botswana and Oman. Again, I mentioned this already. And the social sector basis for development in Costa Rica and Tunisia. In the case of Costa Rica, you had pretty good institutional development, education, health, and environment, democracy. All those kinds of things were important as part of the social sector development in Tunisia. Here, women's rights were taken to heart. You can blame Ben Ali and the others for anything that you want, but there's no doubt that in Tunisia, there was the modern social development, especially the respect for women's rights, and that was an important element. In part, for example, the demographic transition was much earlier in Tunisia and many other MENA countries, for example. Also, the capability-based strategy by South Korea. Again, in South Korea, you can talk about government intervention and all these other kinds of strategies, but the author chose to concentrate on what he called capability. That is building up capacity of not just individuals, but also firms to be able to compete externally. Now, the democratic political system diversity management in India, as I mentioned earlier, is also quite important. There's a long quote here, and the chair is looking at me, so let me not quote that. A quote by the author, who essentially indicated that the diversity itself was quite important, that allowed India to create the appropriate institutions, if you will. And in the case of Mauritius was an example of a situation where, as I understand, 2 Nobel laureates, not just one, 2 Nobel laureates, declared that it was a hopeless case. Hopeless, absolutely hopeless. Well, is Mauritius hopeless? Of course not. Why? Because of institution, democratic political system that was quite utilized, that respected the rights of individuals and so on, provide the appropriate framework for resolving conflicts, etc. And that has worked, quite well. And finally, human development-based development. As a long-term strategy, what do I mean by this? In the case of Costa Rica, the environment was part of it, peace was part of it, freedom was part of it. But that is not the case, for example, with Tunisia. Obviously, one could look at the usual Allah sen, AK sen, in terms of the outcome actually not being just growth and other forms of development, but also freedom as a choice. Freedom becomes an important part of the outcome. But also, freedom can be an important element in terms of ensuring long-term type of development. A case in point is Tunisia. As I indicated earlier, Tunisia was really excellent in terms of using the modernization of the social sector, specifically human rights, women's rights in this case, and other kinds of rights, but it was not enough. It was not sufficient. So what happened? Well, Tunisia imploded, if you will. Why? Because the strategy was not accompanied by political freedoms. So the story here then is that in carving development strategies, it is sine qua non to think about freedom as part of the strategy. Well, this means that I'm almost done. So, we attain success. What do? We celebrate, right? This could be China. It could be any of these successful countries, any of those case studies, celebrating That's wonderful, isn't it? So we celebrate. But then after the celebration, we begin to think, because we have to decide what path to take subsequently. Is it going to be a leftward path, and how left are you going to be going? Is it going to be a straight path? Is it going to be a path to the right? So we begin thinking, which way should we proceed? Which direction should we go next? Why? Because we have this success path, with these are called the success ladders. So you reach the top, well, are you going to remain there? You can also fall back down, right? Like Tunisia, to some extent, is doing today, falling back down. So we don't want that. So what do? We nurture that success. We water that success. We have to do that. We water the success to make sure that we continue. Well, one way to water the success is to buy those books. Buy those books, and there we have, at the corner there, Lorraine, my colleague from UNE Wider, who has a bunch of books, and Adam of Oxford University Press. He assures me that where those couple of books you see there are a million more. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to my spiel, and please buy those books. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Augustine. Now we'll turn to one of the contributors, Ron Finley. Ron, professor at Columbia for many years. Ron is distinguished both by being an economic theorist and an economic historian, and that's a rare but very potent combination. And so, Ron, you contributed to the history of success book volume by yourself synthesizing some of the individual chapters. So, can I just pose to you the question? You're originally from Burma, now rebranded as Myanmar. Do you think the countries whose success you synthesized, Ireland, Japan, Switzerland, do they carry any lessons for Burma, Myanmar now?
Thanks, Paul. That's a very interesting question. All right. So, what lessons might we get from? Just let me take the three countries I was sort of accidentally associated with: Japan, Switzerland, and Ireland. I don't know why those particular three countries got into one section of Augustine's book. You'll have to ask him. But I was asked to comment on those on the papers on those three countries, and I was glad to do that. And I never thought of the question of how these three countries related to Burma, and I didn't say anything about that in my contribution to the book. But I'm very glad that Paul brought this issue up. For one thing, let's take Ireland first, right? Burma, right? I was born in Burma. I grew up in Burma, educated in Burma. Several generations of my family were in Burma, and part of my ancestry is ethnic Burmese itself, but also Indian and Scottish and Armenian and sort of all sorts of things. So that in itself shows you something about economic development and economic. Maybe that's why I'm interested in economic history and economic. Where did all my various ancestors come from, and why did they come to Burma sometime in the early 19th century? So there's this interesting historical aspect. But let me be more specific and more brief. How do Ireland and Burma fit together? You wouldn't think that they did. Well, one way they used to fit together is that the British, who have had something to do with the history both of Ireland and of Burma, used to have this phrase that the Burmese are the Irish of the East. And as I told my friend and co-author Kevin O'Rourke, whom I knew as a graduate student, but is now very grand as the Chichili Professor of Economic History and Fellow of All Souls and so on. As I told him, it was not intended as a compliment to either of us, that we were that the Burmese were the Irish of the East. It meant, happy-go-lucky, sort of, nice, don't work hard, not serious. There were all of those connotations, all right? So, but anyway, there was this facetious linking of Ireland and Britain. But also for Ireland and Burma. But more importantly, in the Burmese independence movement, which began in the 1920s in Rangoon University, which was my alma mater, the Irish example was a very powerful one, right? So the Easter Rebellion and all of that, the whole mythology of the Irish struggle for independence was a very inspirational force in bringing about the independence movement in Burma. So that was an important factor. Japan was a tremendously important factor in Burma's history because Japan invaded Burma during the Second World War and occupied Burma from 1942 to 1945, and again, Japan was a very important example. Again, not only Ireland was the inspiration for the independence movement, but then Japan, as a successful Asian state, was a big inspiration to the Burmese independence movement. Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San, generally regarded as the father of the country, he was one of the 30 comrades, these 30 Burmese independence leaders who went to Japan for military training to fight the British. And the Burma Independence Army that they created came in with the Japanese invaders, but then, they were seduced by the, by the greater East Asian prosperity sphere ideology, but then they discovered that, it wasn't all that it was cracked up to be, and then they collaborated with the British to, against the Japanese. So that was, and after independence was achieved, and Aung San unfortunately died soon after, but the Japanese inspiration, I think, remained within Burma, both, very positively as an example of successful economic development. That is, when I was young, it was not taken for granted. It was assumed by most people that that these differences in development were sort of racial, were ethnically determined. And so the British and the Europeans would always be predominant, and the Asians would always be somehow second class, all right? They may have achieved cultural things and so on in the past, but they wouldn't achieve these things now. And such is the power of a dominant ideology that many people believed it, right? And many people in the older generation, more stable careers, tended to almost accept it and come to terms with it. So there's only the young firebrands who sort of had this confidence that the state of affairs was not an eternal one, and that things could eventually change in a positive direction for the Asian people. So the Japanese were a great example of that. They had actually done it. They had not just promised it, but they had actually achieved it, right? And so their success, even in their early success in the war, even that was taken as an example of them being able to stand up to the Western imperialists. But on the other hand, there was also a negative influence, like the ideology of the Japanese military of the 1930s. That was the ideology that infected the Burmese military, right? Which was an offshoot from these 30 comrades had been given military training by the Japanese, and they absorbed this ideology that the military are the true guardians of the state, right? Politicians, civil servants, they're all corrupt. They can be bought. The true defenders are the warriors, the samurai, the military, and the Tamador in Burma, the royal army. The Burmese monarchy had been overthrown, but the ideology of an army as a national institution, the one institution that can be, the only institution that can be trusted to preserve the dignity and honor and the true spirit of the nation. That is what the army has. And this was very successful but also very pernicious ideology, because it led to, I think it was the ideology that was behind all of the, the Burmese military has been ruling Burma now for something like 50 years. The first military coup was in 1962. Before that, we had a democratic regime, quite successful. I mean, it was not brilliantly successful, but it did quite well. But then it was overthrown by this military coup led by General Ne Win in 1962. And for the past 50 years, the military has been exercising both a political and economic monopoly over the entire country, and not even sort of sharing power with technocrats and bureaucrats and so on, like this happened in Pakistan and case of Pakistan and Thailand, but much more tight and much more direct control. The lack of success on the part of the Burmese military led to, I think, a lot of criticism, but the military, I think, was content to continue to hang on to power, even though they were obviously unpopular. They were obviously, the national economic performance was not successful. But the military itself, the officer class was very comfortable. They were continued to be in power, and so they had no incentive to change. One of the ways they could remain, however, was by becoming a sort of a client state of the Chinese, right? Because having been cut off from access to the Western world, they were propped up by Chinese support and the implicit support of the other ASEAN countries. But then the sort of next generation of military leaders, who are now about 65 years old, the first generation, Ne Win, who died at the age of about 90, then Tan Shui, who's still living over 80 and is retired. This newer generation, say 65-year-old generals, they came to realize that the way that they were heading was that they were simply becoming stooges of China. They were becoming the only way they were surviving, but they were surviving at the price of becoming totally dependent on the Chinese. And then the paradox was, here the Chinese sort of happily, trading and investing with the United States, whereas Burma is a pariah and dependent on the successful partner of the United States. So why not try to become a partner yourself? And the only way in which they could do that, of course, they had to pay a price. It was a relatively small price. The price was let Aung San Suu Kyi out of house arrest. Okay, it's not, in the great scheme of things, it's not a great thing, right? But then, of course, they had to say, we'll let her out, we'll have a constitution, we'll make some adjustments, and so far it's been very successful. I support this success. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi has been very heavily criticized by many people because, she's now collaborating with the regime to some extent, but I think she has to, right? Because you could be a saint when you're under house arrest. Once you get into open politics, it's difficult to be a saint, right? Like Obama was supposed to be the second coming, and all sorts of wonderful things were supposed to happen. But then once you get into power, you have to make deals and you have to compromise, and people say, what happened to that halo? So she's undergoing this situation now. There was the Rohingya problem in Arakan. There was the copper mine issue in Moyua in Burma that is still ongoing, and so she's had to compromise her political. Her integrity. But at the same time, I still have confidence. I have confidence in her, and I even have confidence in General Tan Seng, that he is, of course, he came from the military, but I think he's sincere in wanting to set the country on a new path. So that's the way I think Burma is now. So it's been a long answer, Paul, but it was inspired by your question. Very good.
Thank you very much, Ron. And now we'll turn to my colleague, Anke Huffler. Anke, over to you.
Thank you very much. So when Augustin asked me whether I'd contribute to this session, it's not because I'm a contributor to the book, but he just sort of wanted me to talk on the topic of development successes. And I think one of the sort of really big successes that I would like to highlight is that security worldwide has improved tremendously over the past decades. So if you just look at the global prevalence of armed conflict, then on the y-axis you've got just the number of conflicts, and you run from the Second World War up to today. So 2011 is the last year for which we have data. And the data come from a collaborative effort in Scandinavia, from Uppsala and the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And you can see quite clearly that the number of conflicts worldwide peaked just at the end of the Cold War, so 92, and since then we've had a downward trend. So the good news is the world is becoming a safer place, despite all the bad news you hear. And so the different colors show you what sort of type of conflicts they were. The red ones are what they call extra-systemic, but it's basically wars of independence. So the Burmese struggle will be one of those. And then the green ones are international wars. So note, please, that international wars, so wars between two or more countries, are very rare. And there are quite a few years now where we haven't seen any of those. But it's civil wars, so of course there's nothing civil about these wars. They're brutish and long, but they are the blue ones. The lighter blue shade gives you the ones with a lot of international involvement. So if we think of this global prevalence in terms of region, the light blue is Africa. So Africa has had a very similar sort of trend. So there is less conflict now in Africa than there used to be. And if we think about it by intensity, so how armed conflict is defined is there has to be armed opposition, organized opposition to the government. And there have to be at least 25 people being killed per year to be a conflict. And in order to be a war, you have to have 1,000 fatalities a year. And these might be military or civilian, but not the deaths that result from famines and sort of bad medical care during these war years. So these are battle-related deaths. And of course, it's the case that it's not two armies meeting each other and fighting, but it's the government side killing civilians and it's the rebel side killing civilians. So, and the rebel movement has to be so organized that it can actually inflict serious fatalities on the government. So 5% of the fatalities have to be inflicted by the rebel movement. Otherwise, it would be a massacre or pogrom or genocide. So it's a very specific type of violence I'm sort of looking at here. But again, we can sort of see that the number of wars has declined and the number of conflicts has declined, but not by quite the same. The trend isn't quite as strong. So the good news is we've now got less armed conflict worldwide than we had. And if you're interested in other types of violence, I really strongly recommend Steve Pinker's new book on Better Angels of Our Nature, where he looks at different types of violence, which ranges from these wars I'm discussing to homicides, to violence against women, domestic violence, etc. So he sort of spans, he has got a much broader sort of outlook on violence. Mine is relatively narrowly focused on civil war, which is, and civil conflict, which is typically a problem of poor countries. So, but the good news is, as you could see, there's a lot of countries now at post-conflict. And as Augustine said, we've got to nurture, water this success, because we know from just the numbers that recurrent conflict is really, really the big danger for these countries. They've got an enormously high risk of recurrence of conflict. So these are conflict traps and cycles of violence. About 40% of countries that end a civil war have another civil war within the decade. So these countries then face economic challenges, So they need an economic recovery, and you need to reduce the risk of a new conflict starting up. And of course, these two challenges are interlinked. No security without development, and no development without security. And so I would like to sort of just invite you to sort of think a little bit about what we actually know works and what doesn't in terms of third-party interventions. So I've picked out 4 types of interventions to sort of guard the peace. So what does aid do? What do we know about this? And I'm always going to comment on large N studies, not on specific case studies. So all the evidence I'm going to sort of bring forward now is based on large N studies, a work that Paul and I have done, and others. Interventions loosely, diplomatic, military, and economic interventions, peacekeeping operations, and arms control. So I'll just take you through these. So aid, what does aid do in terms of conflict? We do know that aid does not prevent civil wars. So you can maybe think of some conflicts that were really fueled by aid, and maybe in certain instances where it was prevented. But on the whole, we don't find any evidence that there's a strong link between aid and civil war. But does aid prevent recurrence? Yes, we do find very strong evidence that aid works in post-conflict situations. So in post-conflict situations, you have a peace dividend. Countries do recover, so they do have a higher than average growth rate. And the aid, I know that there is a huge discussion about aid and growth, and I think the consensus is now that aid does not give you growth, but the exception is that aid increases this peace dividend. So if you really want to get a bang for the buck, go and invest it in post-conflict countries. But there's no peace dividend if there's any violence ongoing. So this is post-war situations. A lot of these situations rumble on. There's still a lot of violence. There isn't really completely true peace throughout the country. And if you do not have peace, you do not have a peace dividend. So you don't get above normal growth rates. Interestingly, a work by Monica Toft shows that this peace dividend is independent of conflict termination. So you can think of different ways how conflicts end. It's a military victory of either the government or the opposition, or you can have a settlement, or you can have a stalemate. I've tried very hard for the background to the World Development Report 2011, which was on security and development, which type of aid. So we know aid helps in post-conflict situations, and I've tried very hard to nail down which type of aid would do it, and we couldn't really find a particular, there's no golden bullet that sort of really, if you sort of say, okay, you really got to spend it now on economic infrastructure, or social infrastructure, or debt forgiveness, or social inclusion, that's going to give you peace. It seems to me that there isn't any evidence that one type of aid works better than another, and what the donors do is they allocate aid very similarly, so by type, to post-conflict countries, and that's probably then the correct thing to do. What do we know about interventions? So you can sort of think of intervening before a war even starts, or you can sort of think of intervening in ongoing wars. So intervening in situations that you want to avoid is very difficult to study because you're studying a sort of non-event. There is a little bit of work by Pat Regan and Binghamton, but we've already got a continental early warning system in Africa, and this early warning system has actually led to early action and troop deployment in a number of cases, but we still have too few cases to really have a large N study, so it's too early to assess these in my opinion. Ongoing war, so there's a lot of work on what gets a war going, so the onset of war. But there is much less research on ongoing war, and it seems to be really quite difficult to sort of determine the duration of civil wars. But interventions tend to lengthen the war, and it's unclear which effect interventions have on the type of termination. And that is actually an interesting new point of research because we know from Monika Toft's work that military victories mean that the peace lasts. And so maybe there's a sort of, that this is sort of something we don't know as yet, how we could sort of maybe tie the interventions to the conflict termination and what that would mean to make peace last. So one of the big questions is really whether peacekeeping operations work. And I'm not talking about any military intervention, but UN peacekeeping missions. Do they actually keep the peace? And Paul Soderboom and I have done some work on it, but there are others. Paige Fortner has done a lot of work on it. And there seems to be a consensus now in the literature that indeed peacekeeping operations do keep the peace. And then there's some evidence that they make arms embargoes more effective. But you could sort of say, okay, but hang on, maybe these peacekeeping operations are suffering, or your statistical analysis is suffering from endogeneity. Maybe these peacekeepers are only being sent to the easy cases. And so you would sort of automatically find that peacekeepers keep the peace. But others who have studied UN decisions, amongst them Paige Fortner, sort of think that endogeneity is unlikely because the UN, if anything, sends UN peacekeepers to the more difficult situations. And then I come to my last sort of third-party intervention of arms controls. So there was, so at the moment, countries do have arms. So there's very few countries in the world that produce arms, and a lot of countries that import them. And especially in civil wars, it's small arms and light weapons, so something that can be carried by one person, small arms, or by very small vehicles or mule light weapons, are this sort of really the sort of weapons you really want to sort of think, how do we restrict arms transfer and make sure that they don't go to conflict zones. Now, the US and the Europeans have already got regulations. Lots of other countries have regulations about not sending them. It's not allowed to sort of send them into conflict zones. But there isn't an international binding arms trade treaty. And the negotiations for one broke down in July 2012, and they didn't result in a treaty, and they are ongoing. So what actually happens is that there isn't an amorphous sort of black market for small arms and light weapons, because this is what some people seem to assume, but they are legally shipped, they're legally sold, let's say, to Kenya, and then they end up in South Sudan. So it's a diversion at the end user, and this is sort of how most weapons get into conflict zones. Michael Broschka has done some quite convincing work on it, that embargoes are effective in reducing the flow of arms, but these embargoes have to be monitored. You really need to find out, are these weapons now being used by the Kenyan army, or have they been shipped across to South Sudan, just to stick with that one example. And if I give you just some numbers, where we could sort of do still a lot better is the global trade in arms, that includes small arms and light weapons, but includes everything else, is $40 billion, and the US trade is about half of that. This is from congressional reports. And the US is widely regarded as having the most stringent controls program. So they do actually follow up and look where these arms end up. And this Blue Lantern program costs about $3 million US dollars. So I would have thought there's an enormous potential to scale up. So to conclude, there's no development without security and no security without development. I've shown you, hopefully convincingly, that we've got now less armed conflict globally, but we have got to nurture this success, and I think as an international community we have to sort of think about what can be done from the outside. Obviously there is also lots of things that countries have, and that's what the 2 books are about, have to do themselves. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Annika. That's a really nice, practical example of sort of international progress. Before I open it to the floor, let me just add a few remarks myself. I've just finished a book on international migration from poor countries to rich ones, and in doing that, that's forced me to try and think or rethink why are some countries very rich and some countries very poor. And the history of that thought, if we go back in our subject, Ron, if we'd been posing that question 50 years ago, we thought we knew the answer, which was it's just a matter of some countries have got a lot of capital and others haven't. And then we realized that was no good, that capital is endogenous. And so in the 1980s, another answer came along, it's policies. Right? And the good policies and the bad policies. Hence Washington Consensus, which, as you say, for all its imperfections, is an awful lot better set of policies than the stuff that Ghana had before they came along.
Burma has.
or that Burma tried the alternative for 50 years, yeah.
Albania and a few other.
That's right. That's right. There's been experiments in the alternatives. So that was the 1980s. It's policies. It's not capital. It's policy. Capital's endogenous. It's policies. And then, from about 2000, you get people like Jim Robinson coming along saying exactly the same thing about policies that the policy people said about capital. Right? The policy people said about capital, but there's a reason why some countries have got lots of capital and others haven't. Capital is endogenous. And Robinson and Acemoglu and Johnson and co. come along and said there's a reason why some countries have got good policies and others bad policies. It's institutions. And that's kind of where we are at the moment. The broad consensus is to say it's institutions. And there's clearly some good examples in these books of exactly that. The Robinson himself has a very good chapter on Botswana, which is really a model of answering the question, why is Botswana the exception in Africa? It's done so well when others have done so badly. And he traces it to institutions were different. Institutions were centralized and inclusive, the sort of mantra of the Acemoglu-Robinson Why Nations Fail book, So in my own work, I've tried to think, well, is that all we need? Is it just institutions? And I'm pretty convinced that institutions are awfully important, so I don't want to say that position is wrong, but the question seems to me, the pertinent question is it exhaustive? Do we need to look beyond institutions? Is everything else endogenous to institutions?
Institutions themselves, to an extent, are endogenous.
So, yes, that's right. So, yes, what's the forces that generate these things? And so, I've come up at the moment with what I call social models, and social models are institutions plus 3 other things, which I for the moment am going to argue sort of matter. And what are the other things that matter? Well, one of them is narratives, that I believe societies develop narratives, and some of these narratives are more functional than others. The idea of narratives actually probably goes back to Confucius, but I traced it back to Keynes' theory of probability, where what Keynes was saying about theory of probability was people don't understand probability through a mathematical expectation. They have a sort of theory of causation, which is, if you like, a narrative, and that's how they form their expectations. Now, as a counter to financial markets, Keynes lost that argument, though maybe he's coming back. But financial markets are exceptional in that it's full of professionals, and the people who would really get things very badly wrong are driven out. But most of life is expectations are formed by amateurs, in particular in democracies. Most of the views of causation are necessarily formed by amateurs, and they don't get driven out if they're wrong. They just vote for the wrong people. And so, to take a trivial example, it's in the richest country in the world. You remember the narrative around the election of Bill Clinton, the first election of Bill Clinton. What was Bill Clinton's narrative? It was, "It's the economy, stupid." Now, if you turn to the typical African election, we've just had one in Kenya, you just don't hear that discussion, "It's the economy, stupid." You hear, "It's the Kikuyu." Stupid. But in other words, you hear a discourse which is really very detached from looking at, from discussing economic success. And it's striking that in the richest country in the world, people are voting according to which political team is going to, do I think, will give me the greatest economic success. And in Africa, they're voting by identity, am I a Kikuyu or not, you know? So narratives differ profoundly between societies, and maybe that matters. So in addition to institutions, maybe narratives matter. In other words, the same set of institutions might play out very differently depending on the narrative. I'll give you one practical example. Lots of countries now have investment authorities, which is supposed to facilitate foreign investment in a country. And my hypothesis would be that the actual functioning of an investment authority cannot be understood separately from what is the prevailing narrative in the society about the role of foreign investment. That some societies see foreign investment as this is our route to the future, and other societies see foreign investment as exploitation that has to be curtailed. And so I'd argue an institution which on paper looks the same will play out very differently depending upon the prevailing narrative. And following Keynes, narratives take an awful long time to die, even if they're wrong. So narratives, like institutions, are rather slow-changing things. Then a third thing is norms. And we've already had Steve Pinker invoked, but Steve Pinker's book on violence is very much about differences in norms and the evolution of norms. And he's got this wonderful example of the decline, the profound change in the norm of violence in Europe during the course of the 19th century. Basically, people discovered empathy. At the beginning of the 19th century, parents thought it a great idea to take their children to watch a public hanging. You know, look, Johnny, look at him jiggling on the, you know. It was a real family entertainment. And by the end of the 19th century, people were revolted by that thought, as we are now. And so something happened to social norms during the course of the 19th century, and Pinker's hypothesis, which is very, very striking, is that what happened was mass literacy enabled people to, created a market in the popular novel, and the mass readership of the popular novel taught people to imagine themselves in the situation of other people, and that taught them empathy, taught them to look at the world from another person's point of view. So that person jiggling on the end of the rope that at the beginning of the 19th century was the other, by the end of the 19th century could be me. Right? So norms, we know from, say, from Ted Miguel's work, norms differ enormously, not just they change over time, gradually, but they differ enormously between societies. One of Ted's party piece papers is diplomats in New York and whether they pay parking fines or not. Huge differences. You know, those squeaky clean Scandinavians always go and pay the fines, even though it's all voluntary because diplomats are exempted. You know, and some other cultures, they don't pay the fines, you know, they're opportunistic. So norms differ enormously. They evolve slowly as violence in the 19th century, but they're slow changing like institutions and narratives, and maybe they really matter, you know. Anka's just been talking about violence, but you know, the difference in the level of violence between societies, not just at the grand level of civil war. If you take the murder rate in Jamaica is 50 times higher than Britain. So these are staggeringly big differences in social norms. So institutions, narratives, norms, and finally, it's quite common to lump together in one phrase institutions and organizations. But I wonder, can we think institutions and organizations are actually not the same thing? Institutions, famously in Douglas North's definition, they're the rules of the game. But organizations are not rules of the game, they're teams of people with capacities tasked with doing things. And so I want to end with the concept of what I call effective organizations. Effective organizations are what turn ordinary people from producing $2 a day, which is the norm for most of history everywhere, into producing $100 a day, which is now the norm in the developed economies, but isn't the norm. Many societies are still at the $2 a day level. So an effective organization turns ordinary people into much more productive people. And it's not something about the person themselves. Although we fuss about education, you take this same uneducated migrant who in Africa produces $2 a day, and you put him in New York or Britain, and bang, he's up at the $100 a day level. So it's not something about the person, it's something about the organization they work within. Now we know from Adam Smith what are the foundations of productivity. And they're really, Adam Smith saw it emerge, and it's scale and specialization. Those were the two things that Adam Smith emphasized above everything else. Scale, which enables you to reap economies of scale, and specialization. But scale and specialization come at a price, at a potential price. And scale makes it much harder to motivate people. An organization with 3 people in it, the 3 people almost inevitably are motivated, they work hard. But in an organization of 3,000 people, you might end up with a demotivated. So the potential economies of scale are dissipated by the lack of motivation. Similarly, although specialization gives you the potential for productivity, it also creates problems of coordination and cooperation. And so the nightmare of a scale and specialized organization is that it's still very unproductive because people are unmotivated and they don't cooperate. And of course, the typical large African organization you find in the public sector has scale and specialization, but it's still stuck at $2 a day. We heard about it yesterday afternoon. It's, for example, the education sector. Right? So the genius of a modern effective organization is to reconcile scale and specialization with motivation and cooperation. And to my mind, the key insight on how that is achieved by a modern organization is the new work by George Akerlof, Nobel laureate. His little book on the economics of identity. And his argument is that a successful organization, and he draws most of his examples from the private sector in developed countries, but a successful organization is one which gets its workforce to internalize the objectives of the organization. And it does that by a range of techniques, from selection to indoctrination to training and so on, and leading by example. The developed economies, wherever you look, it's effective organizations, because the ineffective organizations have been driven out. But in poor countries, there are some effective organizations, but they're the exception. They struggle because they're having to hire people who are socialized into the norms of ineffective organizations. And effective organizations, I think there are too few of them in poor countries. They're pioneers, and pioneers create demonstration effects, externalities, which mean that by definition, pioneers are insufficient. They can't internalize the externalities they generate. So, to conclude, my own assessment of what's the difference between success and failure, it's institutions plus. It's institutions plus the transformation of narratives. Actually, the sort of thing you were talking about, Ron, where you said, well, some good things that Burma got from Ireland and Japan was a sense of we can do it. It's a transformation of norms, for example, from the norm of high violence and, say, from the norm of honor codes to the norm of justice is something provided by the state rather than the family. And it's this growth of effective organizations. So, institutions plus is my own conclusion. I've got to pass it back to Ron because I've succeeded him I tell you from my history, a long history of association with Ron, the gems are when you provoke him into something like this.
It's very exciting, this panel. I wasn't expecting all of this, but it's quite fantastic. Well, we had a very informative discussion of security and development from Anchor, right? And in all of the comparative studies, a very important thing is the role of the state. So what do security and the state have in common? Well, what they have in common is, was thought of by an Oxford student of many centuries ago. You may have heard of him. His name was Thomas Hobbes. All right. So he said, without security, life is solitary, poor, nasty, prudish, and short. So you need an effective sovereign to impose law and order. Right. And how this role of the state is exercised. This is a crucial problem, right? In all of these development studies. You can't have successful development without some important role being played by the state. But the state can play, the state in providing law and order, in mobilizing resources and so on, it can act in a benevolent way to maximize the national wealth or national income, or it can act in a predatory fashion to maximize the wealth and income and prestige and power of some minority that is able to get control of the state. And here's where Paul's remarks about very interesting remarks about effective organization come in. I would say one thing, that you can have, these effective organizations can be benevolent or they can be malicious. The most effective organization in Burma, to go back to the Burmese examples, we had one very effective organization in Burma for the last, since the Second World War. Only one, but it was very, very effective. And what was that? That was the Burmese military. All right? So it's a very effective organization with a strong narrative. Okay, they have their narrative. They have a very clear objective, right? But it emphasizes their position within the state, and it's their exclusive authority to protect the state. And it can function in a positive way. to fight against foreign invaders, then it's working in the right direction. If it's let's sit on top of everybody else and maintain control, then it's malicious, right? Then the other thing in my discussion of in the first book from Wider, the other country I was talking about was Switzerland. So what's Switzerland got to contribute? Well, Switzerland was sort of three nations, right? The French-speaking, German-speaking, Italian-speaking, but with these separate cantons who never used to get on with each other from the Middle Ages, but finally came together and formed this effective federal unit. So that is a tremendously important thing to do. And the role of sympathy, I think that is, again, extended sympathy. This is a very important thing. Paul already mentioned Adam Smith, but Adam Smith, one of his, we shouldn't forget that in addition to being the author of The Wealth of Nations, he is the author of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And what is the crucial idea in the Theory of Moral Sentiments is the notion of extended sympathy. Right? That is to say, how does one person relate to other, by putting yourself in the shoes of other people. So this is a doctrine that was, that was conceived by many great thinkers, but as Pinker argues, it was sort of realized only in the very late in human history and in the Europe of the 19th century, as a result of economic progress and the extension of civil liberties and things like that. So all of that has really been very important. So that's the way in which several of these things can come together.
Thank you very much. Let's open it up to the comments and questions. Yeah.
Question for Anka. So there's a very striking decline in post-1990. Yes, the obvious cause is the question is, obviously the withdrawal of the fuel withdrawn by the Soviet Union competing client states. So I guess the question is, to what extent is the decline solely due to the end of the Cold War? What is due to more active action by the international community, for example, US peacekeeping operations, which obviously could have happened without the end of the Cold War, but a conscious decision. So I guess the question is, to what extent we can expect the decline to continue if we continue to do good things in the international space.
Okay, let's take another two if there are a couple more questions, and then we'll turn back to people to answer. Yeah.
A lot of these countries succeeded sometimes because of luck, right? But there's no mention here about luck. I just wonder what you think about that. But the bigger question is, these are all historical successes, right? And societies have a lot of difficulty nurturing institutions of success. They come and go. So what's the lesson? I mean, what's the lesson of what has been successful for countries that want to succeed going forward? I mean, China wasn't considered a success story several years ago. Suddenly it appears. But then some countries, like, I don't know, Argentina, for example, was a successful country and it decayed. Right? So what are we being sort of biased by looking back?
And one more. Yeah. Good. Okay, so let's go back to thinking about those questions on the panel, and then we'll have another round. So, Anka, the first question: decline in violence. Is it the Cold War? Is it the international community getting better, or I suppose is it economic development reducing civil war from within?
So partly you answered your own question. It is very difficult to sort of disentangle the sort of Cold War and the sort of international efforts, because one wasn't possible while the peacekeeping was very different. They did exist, but there's been a proliferation of peacekeeping operations and also mission creep. They do many more things. But I think you could sort of think in broader terms of why were there so many wars during the Cold War, and it's a question of finance. So civil war is a rebel organization fighting the state for various reasons, and they need to recruit and maintain a private army. And one way of doing that is with external help, but that's only one way. You can finance an army in many different ways. And so I think our attention is very much shifted then to sort of how else can countries do it, because in some countries like Mozambique the war was then really over, and it hasn't, because they didn't have any other means to sort of do it, whereas Angola sort of staggered on because they had oil and diamonds. So natural resources are a source, the diaspora community is a source for finance. So I think that's sort of, I think we've learned a lot more about, sort of how we can actually cut these other sources of finance off. And as countries, so the bad news was there are cycles of violence. So if you've had a conflict, you're more likely to have another one. But the good news is the longer the peace lasts, the safer you become. So we can sort of really build on that. Africa, are there going to be more conflicts as it gets hotter? I have to disagree with Ted Miguel and co-authors' analysis on the climate change and conflict. I think I side much more with their critics based in the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, who sort of basically say that this is not a robust result. I agree with them. If we are really thinking about war kills, so these are large-scale armed conflicts, they kill 1,000 people per year, and if water becomes very scarce, so it becomes hotter, there's less rain, it evaporates, it's hotter, it's marginal land already, people migrate away from this. It's not, climate change is going to have a lot of knock-on effects, but I think large-scale armed conflict is not one of them. Small-scale armed conflict, yes, because you are going to fight over these sort of scarce resources, but I think on the whole, resource abundance gives you the finance to fight, and also dysfunctional institutions, and so that's connected with a high risk of conflict, and resource scarcity is not connected with large-scale armed conflict. And if I may, this question was not to me, but on the luck, is it luck? Is it just good luck? There is the author escapes me now, but maybe somebody else can recall it, good policies or good, so growth down to one's own policies or to good luck? Because the world economy is doing well, and there are some authors who sort of really looked at that. So you can disintegrate it into a world component and it into an own component. And I'm sure you can probably really show with out of these 30 countries that some of these were homemade successes and not luck. Unless you're thinking of luck in terms of striking on a resource, and typically striking on a resource is disastrous. It doesn't give you, that isn't good luck. Unlike, unless you're Botswana or Norway, this lucky discovery means misery for you.
So let's follow that idea of luck up, and I'm going to turn to both Augustine and Ron with the same question. Two things were raised by this point about luck. One is that our inability to forecast change, that in 1980, most of the world thought that the next great power was basically Russia, and now we think it's China. Are we equally wrong? And then turning to the idea of luck, I mean, the sort of the big contribution, I think, on the analysis of luck is the black swans idea, where he says, well, quite correctly, that all the big events of the 20th century, the things that actually drove the world economy, were unforeseeable. Instances of multiplicative low probability events. Are we over-interpreting history in trying to explain everything? Augustine first and then Ron.
Thank you. I think there's a saying that he who forgets the lessons of history is likely to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Condemned to repeat it.
Condemned. Thank you very much. It's even stronger than that. Thank you very much. That's right. So really, I think history is important. One must look back. And let me give you an example, for example, of African countries. We look back and we see all the ICE policies, not just African countries, Latin American countries as well. And we know that those policies failed miserably. They failed. Import substitution policy did not work. And so the question is, can we look at history, learn those mistakes, and then pledge never to repeat those mistakes again? So yes, there's a lot to learn from history. Now, in terms of luck, Mao, was it lucky that Mao came around? Or Deng Xiaoping, for that matter? When it comes to leadership, in terms of changing the course of events, the importance of leadership and therefore luck perhaps becomes essential. In that regard, I think luck can play an important part in terms of the appropriate policies. The Cold War, for example, I suspect that a number of countries around the world were lucky to have had the Cold War end because it helped, as Anke indicated earlier, end some of these conflicts, if you will, some of the rivalry. The bipolar world was no longer the case. And a number of African countries, including Ghana, made the appropriate transformation, the appropriate reforms. I suspect that if the Cold War had not ended, bipolarity had been the case, I suspect that the woes of Ghana would have continued for a long time to come. J.J. Rawlings at the time, back in 1982, had no choice but accept the reforms that were imposed upon the economy. And you and I would agree that if it was luck, it was appropriate, it was well-deserved luck. Thank you.
Yes, on the subject of the lessons of history, it's unfortunate. Those who ignore the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it, and those who try to apply the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it too. It's not an easy way out of this historical dilemma. I'll give you one example again. I'm going to do everything at this panel from Burmese experience. I mean, following Paul's suggestion. So I think that's a useful thing. I'll take the example of international trade as an engine of growth. All right. Now that is a tremendously powerful idea that we've all been exposed to, and most of us, I think, definitely including Paul and myself and Augustine, and I haven't known Anke long enough to be sure, but I think she too would say that trade is a powerful engine of growth, all right? And in Burmese history, we exemplify this very well at the beginning from, the British took over Lower Burma in the Second Anglo-Burmese War in the 1850s. Then shortly thereafter, there was the opening of the Suez Canal. Burma had the luck of, the right geography for rice production, so Burma became then with law and order that the British brought, that's a controversial issue, but let's say they did bring it. And that led to a very sustained, successful export economy from about 1870 to 1930. And then there was the crash, right, the Great Depression, and all the troubles that are associated with it. With the collapse of the rice price, there were peasant rebellions, independence movements, race riots against the Indian minority resident in Burma. So there were all these troubles of the Depression. After the Second World War, after the Korean rice boom, you have independent Burma. You can, so once again, you are poised to ride the success of the world economic expansion, right? But the politicians had learned the lessons of history. What was the lesson of history? That these booms don't last, right? So what you have to cut the economy off. You have to save the economy from these volatile external forces. So how do you do that? Well, you have a state agricultural marketing board. What does it do? It fixes the internal price of rice, stabilizes it, but at some small fraction of the world price. So what does that do? That doesn't give incentive, and Ghana did pretty much the same thing. So there was this idea that you have a state export monopoly, right, that deprives the local peasants of the incomes that they could receive, invest the resources in presumably in successful development projects, but in the first place, you restrict the growth of exports by cutting off the incentive, and this leads to tremendous problems. And Burma has been suffering from all of those ever since. And so the fear of a successful participation in the world economy has held Burma back for so long. And there used to be the thought that, Mao Zedong saved China from all of this by having the Great Leap Forward and so on, and we know that was a disaster, right? But then Deng Xiaoping turned it around. Let me say that there's this notion of that the Chinese government is what? It is a disinterested government. That's I think you're going to have a lot of problems with that idea, right? But anyway, so there's a big role for the state. It has to take into account, it's not easy to take into account the lessons of history. So one has to be pragmatic, one has to, do the best one can under the present circumstances. So finally, I think, after having gone through all of these experiences, one should realize that history doesn't always turn up, it also turns down. You have to look out for it, but take the opportunities when they come, but make sure that they will not last forever. I think that is the only safe bet that people can take.
Let me briefly turn to the question about effective organizations and their externalities, and how does a society get effective organizations to spread. So if we start with the externalities, I think there are two externalities from effective organizations. One is that they socialize their workforce into working for an effective organization, right? Into the idea of internalizing the objectives of an organization, so that that socialization, because people move, that socialization spreads, so they're benefiting others. Benefiting others is always bad news from the point of view, in the sense that it's an externality not captured by the organization itself. A second way is that there's an externality, is that effective organizations create demonstration effects. And demonstration effects attract imitation. Imitation effect is very bad for the effective organization. It means competition. If there are weak first mover advantages, which there often are, once a pioneer enterprise has demonstrated that there's a successful opportunity here, you get imitated. That drives down the rents to the pioneer, and so discourages pioneering. So that's the way, that's the sort of the problem. How normally in a society do you get the spread of success? Well, it's partly these externalities, and it's partly through the expansion of the successful. So successful organizations just get bigger. And in Africa, I think there are a number of impediments to that process of effective organizations getting bigger. In the private sector, as you get bigger, you start to get above the tax radar screen, and so there's a lot of evidence that firms prefer to stay small. In the social enterprise sector, which is a big sector in Africa, very often the aspiration of social enterprise or an NGO is, if you like, the beautiful boutique we know that not-for-profits tend to judge themselves not by how many services they deliver, but by the quality of the service. So around the world, the not-for-profits produce very high quality but rather small volume. Right? Look at Oxford, right? Which is a classic not-for-profit which hasn't expanded. And finally, in the public sector itself, where yes, you've got some effective organizations within the public sector and some ineffective ones, there is no mechanism for the effective encroaching on the domain of the ineffective, or very weak mechanism, really. That the public sector boundaries between effective and ineffective organizations are kind of policed by mandates. And the ineffective organizations don't have to have much capability in order to defend their mandates from incursion by more effective organizations. So let's have another round of questions and comments. As you can tell, we're a very wide-ranging discussion, so if you've no comments on any of this lot, you're not very active in thinking about development in Africa. So any our next round. Yeah.
I like this idea about narrative and development for effective organizations. And I'm thinking that if we look at the state level, given the future problems are at the global level, is that retarding in a way our ability to deal with global issues.
Just say all that again, sorry.
Yeah, so if promoting effective organizations requires like, it's kind of a long process, requires more information, information. And we're actually promoting that at the state level. Is there a risk in any way that they retard the process of developing the same norms that would be needed to solve global problems?
Okay. Got it. Yeah. Next comment. Don't go to sleep. Yeah, if you go to sleep, I'll close the session. You can sleep on it.
You talked about NGOs and their inability or willingness to go from being a boutique to being a bigger player. Do you see any mechanisms where they might be able to
Yeah.
Are there any interventions
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, yeah. Last question of our whole session. Who's going to snaffle the last question of our whole session? Yeah.
What do you think is the role of elites in all this? Because I see lots of elements of the social model going back to Mark, who calls it social orders, and he says that organizations seem to evolve in line with the interests of elites.
Okay, that's a very nice question to end on, the question about elites. So I'm going to just quickly deal with the first two questions, which was sort of more specific to me, and then I'm going to throw the elites question over to the other three members, ending with Augustine, who can then use that to open up onto anything he likes. So the first question is, if we build capacities at the national level, is that going to slow building capacities at the international level? I don't think so. I think that a useful concept is subsidiarity, basically, that where things can be dealt with at the national level, it's much more efficient to deal with them at the national level. The tragedy is that an increasing number of issues can only be handled at the international or global level, and we don't have much capability there. So partly I would say the less we burden the international, the better. On the whole, we know how to fix things that need national effort. Some societies haven't yet mastered the capacity to fix things at the national level. Other societies have. If we spread that capacity, we reduce the burden on the global. But there's still, the global is going to be overburdened with issues that it's just not yet developed the capacity to handle. The question about how do you encourage NGOs to go for scale rather than quality, I do have a simple suggestion there, and that is that to my mind, the problem is that at the moment, NGOs get their funding from donations from citizens in the developed countries, basically. And what they need to get funding from citizens in developed countries, to get donations, is that beautiful boutique. They need the image of the perfect, because that's what mobilizes the money. I want to move to a model in which NGOs get their funding not from the citizens of developed countries, but actually from the governments of developing countries. And they get their funding because they're delivering an effective service that the government itself recognizes it can't supply, but that if the NGO demonstrates it can deliver, then it gets expanded funding. So I want to move to a very different way of funding social enterprise. I think social enterprise funded out of donations is sort of condemned, is doomed to this, to the beautiful boutique as its ultimate objective. Now, let me turn first to Anke, then to Ron, and finally to Augustine to answer that question about the role of elites, and from that to anything else that you'd like to add.
Well, maybe I just follow on from your last point, Paul, if I may,
Fair
which
enough.
is, so how do we get NGOs to scale up? And you sort of say, okay, at the moment they can't really scale up, they haven't got the finances, and the sort of people who finance them want to see the or singing or dancing, but they don't really want to see it delivered to or spread too thinly. So they should be financed by governments of developing countries. But will the NGOs, the traditional large NGOs, really want to pick that up? Do they want to be seen as sort of spreading themselves thinly? And what about going one step further and saying you let the for-profit market do it? And why shouldn't you? Because that's actually quite successful in many rich countries, as long as it's properly regulated. And I suspect that might still be the problem with regulation in poor countries. But in principle, it could be done, because I'm not sure whether the NGOs will really, will Oxfam or somebody really want to get involved in this. So elites is a sort of very interesting question, and it does come, leadership was sort of connected by Augustine with the luck question, leadership and luck. And there is this really interesting paper on whether growth depends on good leadership. There is some sort of suggestion that leadership matters for economic growth in countries. So what the authors do is they look at at death in office, but not assassinations, because that could be endogenous, but natural deaths in office. So they look at the 5 years growth performance before the leader dies and 5 years after. And for some leaders, like Mao, this leads to a growth boom, and in some other countries it sort of leads to a decline in growth because they had a good leader die in office. Interestingly, Paul and I have looked at this, whether this is the case in democratic countries, democratic in the sense that they have free and fair elections one after another, and whether their leadership matters as much. So where we have good institutions, basically, enshrined, sort of repetitive, good elections, and we find no evidence for this. So a prime minister dying in office in Denmark hasn't got any effect on, as an example, on the growth performance, whereas in autocracy it does. And work by Tim Besley and co-authors seem to sort of suggest that too. So leadership does go hand in hand with, I think you can't actually completely divorce it from the question of institutions.
Thank you, Anka. Ron.
Yes. There was an interesting question on the national and the international, and once again, drawing on the Burmese experience, and relating back to the earlier discussion of security. One problem that has plagued Burma ever since the Second World War is the internal civil war. And this has been due to the ethnic differences between the national communities. You have the majority, I think, Burmese, then you have Shans, Kachins, Karens, and other various peoples inhabiting the same space and having not been able to get along ever since independence, ever since the British left in 1948. And here it would seem that this is a case where you need probably some outside intervention can help. Locally, there have been efforts towards national reconciliation, but they keep getting disrupted. The latest example is the Kachins. So perhaps with this turn to the outside world, perhaps the UN, perhaps United States, perhaps ASEAN can do something like that. On the question of elites, it's interesting that elites in developing countries can come from different sectors of the community. Normally, you would say that the elites are the most highly educated. In Burma, graduates of Rangoon University, of which I'm proud to say so part of that Burmese elite. But that Burmese elite, the graduates of Rangoon University, were hopelessly destroyed, crushed, killed in the case of a military intervention. More than one, when university students protested against the military regime, and lots of the elite, because they had, the Hirschman thing, exit voice loyalty. Elites have the opportunity to exit.
Yeah.
So I exit. New York had a comfortable, living a comfortable existence. It's very difficult to remain as a rejected elite member in Burma and exercise voice, because you probably get shot or imprisoned or tortured or something like that. So we desperately need elites, and we need elites to stay at home. Not like me, take the easy option and exit.
Thank you, Ron, for that. Augustine, you've got the last 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll use just 1 minute, though. Elites can be benevolent, or they can be malevolent. But it also depends upon the appropriate incentives. Ron, you mentioned the fact that the educated elites leave, but why do they leave? Because we don't have the complementary economic infrastructure to keep them in these countries. And so we end up actually having social public investment loss, because a lot of these elites are actually educated using public funds. So appropriate incentives are very important. Let me mention one element of elite. Nelson Mandela. I suppose he's an elite, right? And his influence was a benevolent type of influence that kept South Africa together. As a matter of fact, South Africa is one of those countries that we discussed in the Wonder Volume, the second volume, as having the appropriate institutions that prevented chaos, political chaos in that country, and therefore economic chaos. So yes, elite can play an important part in the process. One more point. UNU Wider, in its wide array of production of knowledge, if you will, has a book called The Role of the Elites in Development, also published by Oxford University Press. So once again, I'm not going to say buy that book, but at least read that book as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, everybody.